Comrades, you're all very welcome to this meeting of Workers' International Network. And tonight we'll be discussing the United States and the developing crisis right across the country. The speaker is Jack Grierson with a long history of involvement in the socialist and working class movement in the States. Following Jack's opening contribution, by the way, we were to have other speakers, but unfortunately, Jack will be the only speaker to introduce the topic. Following Jack's opening intervention, comrades are free to make contributions of their own, to ask questions, to further develop points which Jack will have raised in his opening contribution. So I look forward to a really good discussion. The situation in America is changing by the day. There was that shooting or attempted shooting last night, this morning in terms of Irish time. And Trump is milking it to the maximum degree that he can, claiming before any information was officially revealed that he was the target of this attack. And the previous attacks on his life helped him. It was a factor contributing to his election the last time around. So it suits him, this kind of individual activity around the edge. We can discuss that a lot more. And then evidently, the complete collapse of the Democratic Party in the face of all the positions that are developing in America. For example, the Democrats are now very much in favor of tax cuts in the regions that they control, thinking that they can use the Republican kind of tactic to win support. The trade union movement has largely remained silent in the face of massive threats, particularly in the technology sector. You have five geeks, five men, controlling all the major five companies involved in the rapid development of AI, which can, even though it has tremendous potential in terms of human endeavor, will be leading to hundreds of thousands of job losses in the short term. So there's a lot of issues to be discussed, and I look forward to hearing Jack's opening contribution. But like I say, as soon as Jack is finished, comers are free to raise points of their own, to develop arguments, or to ask questions. So, Jack, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Finn. So, as Finn said, I was expecting that two others, at least, were going to be here. Who Roger had written to the three of us, including Cliff, who people have heard before from Minneapolis, and Joel, who, like me, is from Oakland, but Joel is on a ship. Well, I think he's back now, but I don't think he's here yet. And Cliff is not going to be able to make it. He had prior appointment apparently with his family. And I was hoping actually that Cliff could be speaking about what's going on in Minneapolis, because I think that, as I'll discuss briefly, the U.S. working class is vast and extremely fragmented in many ways. And Minneapolis was an example, as people know, and people heard Cliff, of a tremendous fight back. And I think everyone, including me, are interested in what is the state now. What's the aftermath, and what are the developments out of it, what's been sustained. But Cliff won't be here, and I can't tell you the answer to that. I'm going to touch briefly on things which I suspect everyone has already heard. I know you've heard it from me and from others, which is, well, I'll make one point first. I have to observe, since Finn mentioned Trump and the apparent assassination attempt yesterday, Trump is using this now to claim that this monstrous ballroom that he's erecting after destroying the East Wing is needed, because the assassination attempt was in a hotel ballroom, and it wouldn't have happened if they only had this gigantic, monstrous edifice attached to the White House. And that's typical Trump. But how did we get to this point where this guy, who is such an obvious delusional, narcissistic huckster, and who lies with abandon and loves to rub his opponent's face in everything, who's clearly a monster. How did he get to be elected twice? And you have to look to the I think if you look back at what happened in the near financial meltdown in 2007, 2009, and what preceded it and triggered it and what came out of it. There was the deindustrialization and what, for lack of a better term, I'll call neoliberalism, structural adjustment, severe austerity and downsizing, privatization. There was a huge increase in inequality, and that happened especially in the more moderate income levels in the working class, which fell dramatically down towards the bottom, which was already there and didn't fall much more. And that especially, was felt in the Rust Belt, in Michigan, Ohio, West Virginia, Western Pennsylvania, parts of Minnesota, which have become an electoral stronghold for Trump. Well, and they had been similar to the North in England. They had been a stronghold for labor, and they voted Democratic traditionally, but no longer. And in fact, they are, and I think remain virulently for Trump. What happened was the entire establishment, including and maybe especially the Democrats, were viewed correctly, as responsible for the policies that of austerity, downsizing, the fact that workers' standards of living were falling. Many lost their homes, lost their jobs, and their families' future. That's not unique to the U.S., but it happened especially in the middle part of the country, especially in the Rust Belt and somewhat in the Plain States. And the Democrats, you can go back to Jimmy Carter and his trilateralism, but especially Bill Clinton in his second term, who blocked with the egregious Senator Phil Gramm of the Republicans in basically putting deregulation on steroids, and what the Democrats offered as a party was a smug, elitist attitude, which was basically denigrating the cultural values of workers and emphasizing, what we now call identity politics, and using the cultural issues to essentially attack the standards of living of the working class, and that was perceived. And the labor bureaucrats, who essentially, are not only tied to the Democrats, but in many parts of the country, like where I live, represent the Democratic Party apparatus, the county committees and so on, fell in line, and and that's what they offered. It was essentially an attack on the standards of living of the working class, which the entire, what we'll call the elite, the entire center left and center right, were promulgating. And there was a reaction to it. And that reaction you saw in 2015, 2016, a populist reaction. It had been preceded by earlier, first the Tea Party on the right, and then Occupy on the left. But in 2015, 2016, you got a mass electoral responses of support for Donald Trump and support for Bernie Sanders. And often, as I think people know, it was the same people who were supporting both of them. It was revolt against essentially the policies of the ruling class, and the ruling class parties of Republicans and Democrats inside those parties. Trump took over the Republican Party. Sanders for various reasons, which I'm not going to have time to go into. The Democrats are more resistant to that, and Sanders didn't break with them. Instead, Sanders and his essentially reference program um, uh, played the role that he has always played, which is to stand at the gates, as putting forward, with his very effective and charismatic rhetoric, standing at the door to the pen, herding workers in. And ultimately refusing to break with the Democrats and supporting Hillary Clinton. And it's hard to find an individual more distasteful than Hillary Clinton, other than Donald Trump, and probably is more egregious. So the Democrats became the tied in and actually champions of these neoliberal policies. The Democratic Party essentially not only embraced austerity, but they became very closely and willingly identified with the Silicon Valley billionaires and with Hollywood stars and Wall Street. Um, and uh, and the labor leadership went along with this. And the labor leadership essentially uh, continued their role of phone banking, door knocking, and turning out the vote for the Democrats and holding back struggle. Okay, so um, I'm going to jump now to today because I don't want to speak very long, and I was hoping that keep it even shorter and have other people talk about what's going on. So I will talk about something that's going on, which is on May Day, which is Friday, right? Yeah. There's going to be uh, something called May Day Strong. People may have heard of it, um, which is essentially another No Kings Day, but this time with organized labor participation. In the previous No Kings rallies, you had, I think, 8 million people turning on the last one. And they've been, one day, rallies organized by uh, Indivisible, the Working Families Party, and MoveOn.org, all, firmly entrenched in the Democratic Party. Working Families Party were the big backers of Zoran Mamdani, which I'm not going to talk about Mamdani right now, but we can talk about him. He's basically uh, his sui socialism policy has, not surprisingly, hit the reality of capitalism, and he is unable to carry out any of his policies without, the support of Wall Street, and he's, in the process of rolling back all his promises on rent, on the homeless, and so on. We can talk about that later, maybe. So May Day Strong is it was basically promoted especially by the teacher unions and the SEIU, the Service Employees International Union, one of the largest unions. The teacher unions, the National Education Association, NEA, is the largest union in the country, and the American Federation of Teachers is one of the largest. Um, and, uh, and they're promoting it, and especially the Chicago Teachers Union and the California Teachers Association and California Federation of Teachers. Um, and the nurses union, the National Nurses Union, is also active. And what uh, here's what it is and what it isn't. It's going to be a day of action, not a day of strikes. There may be some strikes in certain places, but it's being promoted as no no school, no shopping, no business as usual. And I expect that you'll have in many places many teachers taking sick days, and And in some parts of the country, like in Madison, Wisconsin, the school is going to be closed. In Raleigh, North Carolina, a university town, there's apparently going to be some form of strikes. And I think there'll be more in Detroit than elsewhere. I wish that Cliff were on because I'd like to know what's going on in Minneapolis. So it's a huge country, and there will probably be, the consciousness is uneven, and I expect that there'll be some more militancy in some places. But overall, in the Bay Area, it's clear that this is not a day of strikes. I don't know of any strikes in not only in Oakland, but in the entire Bay Area. Now, a day of action. Well, I was the chair of the Oakland East Bay Committee for the March 4th, 2010 Day of Action at the end of this mass movement on education in the state of California, where we had several thousand people coming out and marching and rallying, and it was a very positive day. Days of action can be. We'll see where this one leads, but that was then and this is now. And just to have a replay, in this case, it seems to me that the union leadership is being pushed from below because living standards are really being hit. And they were hit before, this war that Trump cooked up. The affordability was already, the big crisis for working people. Crisis might be too strong a word. And now with the skyrocketing price of oil and various commodities, groceries, and so on, um, added to the already difficult situation, there is growing dissatisfaction in the working class. Trump's popularity has fallen to 30%, although he retains the support of about 80% of Republicans. That's even fallen by 4% or so. So there's a reaction from certainly real discontent from below. The labor bureaucrats all along play the role of trying to restrain militancy and try to channel it back. And they're certainly afraid of initiative from below. They want this, in my opinion, they want May Day to be a rally for the Democrats, pointing to the November elections. Are there strike committees? Are they organizing rank and file? No. Is there workplace organizing? No. There's certainly not going to be a general strike. They talk of a general strike when? May Day 2028. They say it takes years to organize a general strike. Now, just hearing that tells you what their entire approach is. I hope I don't have to comment further on that. So overall, the labor bureaucrats want to restrain struggle and channel it to the Democrats for the November elections. That's always, been their policy. It remains their policy. However, the fact that they have entered into the demonstrations this time with organized contingents, which they didn't do in the three previous No Kings rallies, is an indication that there's something going on from below. And I think it's important to watch to see in which areas there's more militancy brewing. I can talk maybe I don't know if I have time about what's going on with housing. I'm actually involved in in some local housing struggles right now. What's going on in this country is an unprecedented level of corruption and looting by the Trump administration, and it's going all the way down from top to bottom. It's a barely restrained, if restrained at all, attack on working standards, and the labor leadership has responded in the way that I've already said. Now, one other thing in terms of the responses in 2015, 16, and today, there is no mass alternative. There is no alternative to the Democrats and Republicans, no organized alternative. People have no place to turn. When they're going to vote in November, who are they going to vote for? Many won't vote. We know that's the case in the US. But there is no organized party of the working class. And I don't see, right. Well, you don't know what will happen, and things could happen very rapidly, but right now there isn't. And I'm not going to have time to talk about the falling position of the U.S. internationally and the weakening of U.S. imperialism and so on. I'm not going to talk a lot about Donald Trump because I think that there's much too much space given to Trump and his mutterings, which are the essentially random noise from someone who's always had delusions of grandeur and is now completely delusional and only needs to be reported on because he controls enough weaponry to destroy the world, which is why he's being humored, like a kid, with a stick of dynamite running around. So I'm going to stop there. And if there's anyone else, I haven't looked to see who's come on. If anyone else from the U.S. has come on, then I think that I'd much prefer that they talk rather than my continuing to babble.
Thank you very much, Jack, for that opening contribution. You'll have an opportunity to come back again to deal with some of the issues that will be raised by the comrades. So now, if anybody wishes to speak in this discussion, just indicate with the electronic hand or wave our arms about, but I'm just watching now to see who wants to come in at this point in the discussion. All right, Matthew.
Okay, seeing as nobody else wants to. Yeah, thanks to Jack for that. Very, very useful. In terms of situations, you say, I mean, quite, appalling for much of the US working class. I mean, obviously, you would really start from the fact that US imperialism is facing defeat in the Middle East. I mean, effectively, okay, I can say, and you can see why. The US military, in the shape of its retired officers, the usual spokespersons, have been vehemently against any attack on Iran for the last several decades, because obviously they thought they could understand it wasn't going to go well, and it didn't. And the question then also, of course, becomes, the question of the control of the Middle East and wider, and the disintegration of imperialist structures. I mean, even down to NATO, the alliance of death, threats to chuck out Spain, etc. So there you see the whole structure being further destroyed by Trump. Which, I mean, I think the thing about Trump obviously is the fact that represents, to a degree, the crisis of the system, as opposed to that behind him lie, as you say, the five tech bros and all the rest, and the sort of parasitism, naked parasitism of the US ruling class, which is now, I mean, essentially saying to the rest of the world, look, we run this place, you better give us some more money because we need it. It's effectively the offer to the rest of the world, but in those terms, you tend to say, well, okay, what actually is, as you say, what's actually happening within the US itself? What's the state of control of the working class? What's the political state? And as Jack said, the question would be, is there, or can there be some kind of alternative to the system as exists? Because, I mean, there's not even the pretense of a workers' party of any sort, and the union bureaucracy is, as you say, totally welded into the system. And in the case of likes of O'Brien of the Teamsters, actually, essentially has joined Trump. O'Brien addressed the Republican conference, did he not? In those terms, and we're already seeing as a vast array of layoffs, people being thrown out of jobs and so on, with the agreement of the of the bureaucracy. The fact there's no resistance to people, certainly not from the union bureaucracy, of people being thrown out of work, which of course is going to accelerate. And the question is, okay, as you say, in terms of May Day, and the interesting thing about May Day, as you say, is that it becomes this, actual mass movement, which is, is different. Coming from Britain, obviously, where we don't really have May Day, because obviously nobody's ever had a strike on May Day of any sort, or demonstration or day of action on May Day. They always do it the weekend after, because obviously you can't offend those who shouldn't be offended. But the fact that it exists on the day itself is important. And as you say, in terms of the upwelling of resistance and the determination to fight, despite the fact that their own organisations are, part of, the reunions are essentially part of the Democratic Party and part of the system. And it will be interesting to see, in terms of, can there then be? The key thing is there going to be a political break of some time away from the Democrats, under these conditions.
Thanks, Matthew. Interesting points that you've raised there. So it's a wide open discussion. So comrades are free to develop arguments as they see them. Is there any further indication there? Yeah, I'll just take an opportunity to ask Jack a question about the so-called democratic sources of America. They seem to me to be completely washed up, even though they're part of the Democratic Party and they pretend they're a kind of left-wing force. I'd like to hear a bit more about them, and a little bit I'd like to hear about. I know we're all critical of the union bureaucracy, but they can't escape the discontent about the cost of living crisis that's happening in America. Americans are becoming increasingly impoverished and finding it very difficult to meet the bills, particularly in the energy sector. Now, where is that being reflected politically? So you're right about the unions not taking up the questions, but where is that anger being directed? So that's a question. And also this the threat, Matthew also alluded to it, the threat that's being posed by the 5 large companies that control the AI sector. The purpose of developments in the AI sector is to cut jobs, is to save money by sacking workers. There's nothing else involved. The capitalist system functions in that way, even though there's tremendous potential in health, in research. There's a whole range of areas where AI could be extremely useful in human development, but it's being used by the capitalist firms to cut jobs. No, is there a reaction to that? Is there an anticipation of that? Is there some kind of demands emerging in terms of defense of jobs? So these are questions that Jack might, if there's a gap in the discussion, might have a chance to deal with. So,
do you want me to comment on them now?
We'll just wait a moment, Jack. Yeah, certainly.
Sure.
We'll just wait to see somebody else
I'm happy to wait.
Wants to ask questions at this point, and if not,
Sure.
No. Okay, Jack, you're on again.
Okay, so taking them in reverse order, there's AI, which I certainly agree with you. It's motivated by attempting to cut the cost of production by throwing workers out of jobs or forcing them to work for less in competition with it, which is what technology does. But one of the questions is, will this time, unlike the past, there not be essentially a replacement where you have a dislocation of workers and layoffs in the industries which are being automated, but workers find jobs elsewhere. It looks like this time it may be different. Have to be careful. I remember going back years ago and reading the literature on automation from Marxists and non-Marxists alike back in the late 1950s and early 1960s, which were predicting basically mass unemployment, that automation was going to throw virtually the entire working class out of work, and that didn't happen. This looks like it may be different because this automation is going to service jobs, white collar jobs, and so on. Not just the industry now. Auto plants, of course, are basically almost completely robotized, and so. But where is the anger at this? I'm not sure. You see, and what we didn't talk about is the egregious treatment of immigrants, documented and undocumented, the unbridled racism um, of the Trump and his allies being directed especially at Latinos, um, and and we saw the response in Minneapolis to that. So there's tremendous anger and a response that boiled over there. Will that happen elsewhere? Will it take the form of labor? As I said, I think that the labor bureaucrats play the role of restraining, that anger. Um, in the U.S., historically, what we've seen is at some point that anger spills over into mass struggle and mass uprisings, as in the 1930s, with the huge strike waves that threw up the CIO came out of, and then accelerated, um, uh, and we've seen that time and again in 1877. The mass uprisings. The reason that they built armories around the country is to try to restrain the working class and put in all kinds of legislation after mass uprisings in 1877. There was the 1930s, and there are many other instances. We haven't seen that yet, but we may, particularly because there is no organized political alternative, no mass party of the working class. We're likely to see, something I think bubbling over into tremendous explosions. Occupy was an example of another, such explosion. But I can't point to anything directly other than, what happened in Minneapolis right now. But I would expect that. DSA. I was hoping Joel would be here because I believe Joel participates in DSA. DSA has become, first of all, DSA grew some, based on the Mamdani campaign, not as much as its tremendous growth after Sanders, but it did grow with the Mamdani campaign. But Mamdani has predictably hit the shoals. That is, you can't have socialism in one city, and his variety is sui-socialism. Sui-socialism used to be an epithet, which we would hurl at the reformists. Now they proudly proclaim themselves to be sui-socialists and will, present, major reforms, pro-working class, in housing, in consumption with, opening grocery stores, in transportation and so on. But as soon as Mamdani came into office, he has had to retract his promises on one after the other, which was known in advance that in order to get the money he needed to get a huge influx. He needed to get new taxes approved by the New York State legislature and governor, who have authority over New York, parts of the New York City budget, which wasn't going to happen. This Democratic governor, Kathy Hochul, and she was clear that she wasn't going to do it. And he's tried to make various concessions to her. It's not happening. And through, and basically Wall Street, which, basically read him the Riot Act as soon as he came in. Mamdani's program is almost identical to that of Bill de Blasio, 2 mayors back. Like de Blasio, he's backed by the Working Families Party, a kind of institution, progressive Democrats. And his program is almost identical. The difference is that he's more charismatic than de Blasio. And he constantly has his phony smile on, but he is I'm afraid that many of those who backed him, and I'm talking about him because he's, I think, a DSA member and had enormous support. and tens of thousands of volunteers organized by many through DSA. And this is just going to, be disillusioning. So what is DSA now? DSA politically has many different tendencies in it. Many of the old Trotskyist groups, including some of the fragments from the CWI, have entered into DSA. There's a caucus called Reform and Revolution, which was led by Philip Locker, who some may remember. He was responsible for throwing John Throne, Richard Meller, and John Ryman and company out of the CWI back 20 years ago or so. And Locker led this group, but now they have forced Locker out. And they appear to be a group which is concentrating on orthodoxy, on putting forward, the importance of the transitional program as a thing in itself, and basically trying to, I think, recreate a Leninist sect inside of DSA, strong democratic centralism, and so on. And so you have there's an international committee which is essentially dominated by campists, the enemy of my enemy is my friend types, and that they have been dominating the international policy of DSA. So I think that DSA's day is spent. I don't rule out that you can have another Mamdani type occurring someplace else, but the great hope that people were expressing in a Mamdani AOC is basically showing her colors, is gone. But what's the alternative? The reason that so many groups and individuals have gone on the left are in DSA is because it's the only, even approximately, mass organization that there is. There are about 100,000 members or so. Only about 10,000 are active, but 10,000 is a huge number in the U.S. compared to anything else. The question is, can you operate in there? From what I know of it and my brief experience in years ago in trying to intervene, is that people come there and are turned off by what they see. At the time, years ago, it was complete tight control by a clique. And now it's, I think, just a scattered, heterogeneous group that's bickering. But there is nothing else, and so I think that you're going to find that people are going to be looking for influence, because there are still thousands of people, and it's the only place where, at this point, until we have this mass upsurge, which I believe is going to come, people are going to be looking there. You can't really look to labor. There's nothing much appealing there. So. So I'm not a fan of DSA, but I do think that it's going to be the arena that you're going to find, people attempting to struggle in until there's something more. And there's another question, and that's a question which goes to labor and what it's not putting forward in May Day and in DSA and so on, which is, what are people putting forward as a program for what's needed in the U.S. And internationally? What is being put forward? Is the labor leadership forcefully putting forward even an international, demanding the U.S. out, and pull back its bases, and slash its military spending by a factor of 10 or so on, and provide more jobs, provide a real alternative to to the job loss from AI, deal with the need for national health care, the need for decent housing for all, where the homeless crisis gets worse and worse and spreads to those of very low income and low income and so on. No, those are not being put forward. And you don't really see that being put forward aggressively inside of, from what I can see, out of DSA. But those kind of programmatic points, I think, are at least as important as the need for a political break and a party of the working class. And the party of the working class needs to be based on something like that. But it's easy for me to say that. And it's not happening as far as I can see.
Thank you, Jack, for the interesting insights into developments in the DSA and the potential that some people see in working within that structure to advance socialist ideas. Just an interesting contribution, Jack. Thank you. Once again, let's open the comrades to take up any issues they wish, ask further questions, or try to develop points. Have a look at the historical events in the US and the significance they had. For example, May Day started in the US and the killings in Chicago, and the Second International advanced the case for the 40-hour week, 8-hour day. Okay, Felicity. You're muted there, Felicity. Okay.
It's quite sad listening to what has been said, but on a practical basis, we're facing very similar things in Britain. We thought we had 800,000 people willing to get involved in a socialist party, but that's been, damaged, shall we say. But there are loads of activists in the movement here in the UK and in Europe who are really interested in what's happening in America. And it would be useful to have some suggestions as to how we as activists can link up with people in the States. They don't have to be ideologically pure. We just want to, ideally, you'd want to have some working class organizations where you can just share what's working for you. How's the campaign working for you on this? How's the campaign working for you on that? So there's something real going on. Obviously, when there's a trade union struggle that involves an international corporation, that's almost instinctive. People will do that. But is there any other way? Because, there's that 800,000 in Britain that said they wanted to join a party when Zara Sultana announced it, does reflect a real feeling in the country, and it's subsided but not gone away. So all the activists, how can we link up with the States in a very, active and not discussing some grand remote theory, but how do you tackle this issue? How do you tackle that issue?
Okay, Felicity. That's an interesting question, which I'm sure comrades will have ideas on. It's an interesting path to direct the discussion. Harry, you're next with your hand up.
Yeah, I was just wanting to ask Jack about how important the midterm elections are going to be in November, because it appears, unless Trump gets a serious foreign policy success, maybe he resolves what's happening in the Middle East, perhaps even claim that he might be able to resolve things in Ukraine. But it seems that the importance of those midterm elections, that if things are going that way, the Republicans will lose complete control now of the Senate and Congress. And I'm just wanting to know what's the real consequences of that to happen if the Democrats now were to take control, and they've been very lenient, really, with them in the wars and what's happening inside the country. I'm just wondering what the real significance of that will be. Is that effectively the end of Trump? Is that any possibility? Although I'm not sure if you can actually stand it another term, but he's finished now. He's certainly, from his point of view, he seems to be putting a very serious emphasis on in those elections. He's trying to curtail the voting that's going to take place in the country. He may even attempt to try to cancel the election entirely. And if that happens, it all seems to be all eyes are in November. And what's the consequences of that? How does the people see the midterm elections? Would they see a change in even the foreign policy, as well as the internal policy, what's happening inside the country? Because the energy crisis, although America is self-sufficient in oil and gas, I mean, those products are sold in the world market. And there seems to be enormous hardship already taking place in America from the ordinary working class people of the energy crisis that's unfolding. So I don't know. It's a bit of an insight to see if maybe Jack gives what's the consequences of that election in the midterm? Will it change, if anything at all, for America? And is the American people keeping their eyes on that election for any significant change within the country? Thanks.
Thank you, Harry. That's a good issue to raise at this point, the upcoming midterm elections. And to what extent do people turn to these elections in order to make their point, not to achieve the transformation of society, but to express their opposition, particularly to Trump and his policies at home and internationally. So the chances of change happening and the significance of the vote. And as I think Jack said, there may be a huge abstention, which would actually be to the advantage of Trump. And he will then broadcast that as not just a victory, but the greatest victory ever, which is the terminology he uses for every event. I saw recently this new arch he's building in Washington. Somebody asked him, who is that being built for? What's it meant to commemorate? And he said, me. As if we didn't expect that answer. Anyway. Felicity, is your hand up since the previous contribution, or did you want to make an additional point?
No, sorry, legacy hand.
Legacy hand. Okay, Karen.
I think a couple of things. Looking at the elections, can you hear me? I have my earbuds in. Okay. Looking at the elections, I think that now, in some ways, the elections or the looming elections are a problem, because the Democrats keep talking about the elections, and much of America keeps talking about the elections, and we can vote them out and all of this sort of stuff. The problem is that I think that distracts and diffuses what could be potential action. All of the Democrats go on social media and so forth, and they keep paddling in the same place without an apparent recognition that our political system is completely changed. We had so much voter repression suppression and repression in the last election that it really, in my opinion, was not really a free and fair election. That is continuing. We now have this war on mail-in ballots. I live in Washington State, and all of our ballots are mail-in. States can't recover quickly from that and can't put another system in place. Who knows where that will go? But so I think that looking at the elections in that way is sort of a distraction for one group. Is part of something else I wanted to say about the anger. I think that the anger is divided, and we somehow need to, and I don't know how it happens. The anger needs to be united. So on the one side, you have the protest types, anti-war in Iran, anti this, anti that. I think the protests are great, but they leave out a significant portion of the population. The other part of the population is they're angry at immigrants. They're angry at Democrats. If their gas prices go up, it's because of the Democrats. If they lose their job, it's because of immigrants. They want the immigrants gone. So I think that the anger very much reflects the other divisions in our society and our politics. And I really don't know how those two populations can come together, which is what I think is needed in order to really have an uprising. It is interesting to me to hear Jack say that there is about this May Day thing. I follow a lot of these things. I live in Washington State in the eastern, more conservative area. I have heard little to nothing about this May Day event. So I wonder how much the diffusion of information is limited. And I think that the cohesion or coalescence of action is also limited. And I would love to hear people's ideas on how that can possibly come together in a society where we are divided, and it seems that all kinds of forces are pushing us to remain so, or even become more divided than we are.
Thank you, Karen. That's a very interesting question for comrades to examine about unifying or bringing together in some way the various campaigns that people become involved in that arise from their own experiences in daily life and the importance of such unity. A point also that Felicity alluded to, that the campaigns in themselves require attention and not just people marching in telling everybody what's the correct general approach to take. But these day-to-day campaigns which involve people are very significant everywhere, but particularly significant in America, where we're looking for ways in which opposition to Trump can gain coherence and maybe achieve some effective results in the immediate future. So that's an interesting question, Karen. So comrades should have ideas on that, and it's certainly worth considering. There's several comrades who are well used to speaking and have lots to say, haven't put their names forward at this point. So I want to encourage comrades who do have experience in these issues to aid the discussion by contributing their own experiences and ideas. So we're still open for takers. While we're waiting, Jack, do you want to make some additional points at this stage?
Yeah. So we'll start with Karen's point. First of all, yes, the elections are a distraction to distract from and divert from struggle. This is not new. This is what happens with elections in this country over and over again. You can look at movements which arise and then get diverted and damped down. And as long as there's no alternative to the to the Democrats and Republicans, you're going to find that there's going to be a large abstention vote, and there are going to be many who opt for the Democrats. How do we get around that? Well, and that's the other part of your question, which is how do you have a unified struggle? Well, you need if you had actually either a mass upsurge beginning and or an electoral alternative, even incipient, then programmatically, you would attempt to bridge the gap and you would attempt to incorporate. There's this division. You see, this is historically this goes back all the way. In the U.S. the scapegoating, the destruction of the mass populist uprising after the Civil War and the end of Reconstruction by pitting the poor whites against poor blacks in the South, out of which came Jim Crow, for example. among many examples that we have. So how do you deal with it? In the 1930s, it was dealt with in the CIO upsurge. There's an example. A good example is what happened in the 1934 mass strike in San Francisco, where the longshore, led by the longshoremen, the ILWU, they went to the Black community and said, "We need your support, and what we will offer is to help you to get good, high, well-paying unionized jobs on the waterfront in our union, the stevedores." And that alliance was promulgated, and the ILWU became a union which actually is majority Black, and that came out of that struggle. There are many such examples that can be given. In terms of May Day Strong not penetrating in Washington State, May Day, as I said at the outset, I expect that you're going to find that there'll be some areas, but not many, in which you actually do see some militancy. It's deliberately not being promoted it's being promoted the way that the labor leadership promotes everything, which is, where there's pushback, they'll attempt to channel it and to offer, this something to the working class to divert struggle, not dissimilar from the way that elections are used to divert struggle with no alternative. And that's being used by, in most areas of May Day Strong, as I said, no strike committees, no workplace committees, and you barely hear about it outside in many areas outside of teacher unions and nurses union and so on, which do put out mailings and information. I get many emails about it. I know a retired teacher in Southern Illinois, Springfield, the state capital, who has been active in trying to build for May Day Strong there. She says that the state teachers union, the Illinois Education Association, when she has raised, we should be organizing for a strike on that day, say, don't use that word. Don't talk about strikes. No such thing. That they are pushing back against any form of militant local organizing. This is the character, but the question is, are we going to see, nevertheless, the fact that they have been forced this time to organize contingents? Will we see more? Will there be openings from it? That's what we have to look at, not starting with what, with our conceptions of what would ideally happen. But maybe there'll be opportunities, hopefully. Harry, on the midterm elections, right now, the prevailing wisdom has been for some time that the Democrats will get a majority in the House, but not the Senate. However, now it looks like the Democrats might actually, there are a few key races which they win, they might get a majority in the Senate. What will that mean? What the Democrats are going to do if they win the House is they're going to subpoena the Republicans. The White House staff and cabinet members and so on, and have them testify and use that, as a distraction to avoid anything real. Will they actually succeed? Certainly Trump and the Republicans are going to try to decertify votes, challenge votes, get elections thrown out, and so on. However, I don't know that they're going to succeed in doing that. Recently, the people may know that there was a redistricting done, with Trump's support and encouragement in Texas, where there was gerrymandering of seats, and I think they changed 4 seats. And so Newsom, the Democratic governor in California, said, well, we're going to do the same thing here. And then in Virginia, a referendum just won to change the districting there. Now, I'm not in favor, by the way, of what Newsom did. I don't think that the response to to restricting and subverting the election process. The way to fight that is by institutionalizing the Democrats, through letting them, redistrict and get their safe seats. But the reason I'm bringing it up is that it indicates the limitations of what Trump has actually been able to do. He's also starting to finally get some court decisions, even by the Supreme Court, against him. Will they follow through? Will they declare martial law? I don't think so. I don't think Trump has the stick-to-itiveness, the discipline to stick to anything long enough for that. However, I could be wrong about that, and he has people in place, advisors, and who do have that philosophy and do want to carry those things through. That would require effectively a coup, and it could lead to a real breakdown in civil society. I don't think we're at that point, but I don't rule it out. In terms of what Felicity said, I think that's an important question. And I don't, I can just speculate like others. It seems to me that one of the questions that there are a couple of questions. One is on the war right now, in joint attempt to have joint collaboration or work. Is there possible for linking up? No, I'm not sure what would be linked up with what, but that would be an area. Another is on immigration, open borders, and so on. That's a major question, and it's only going to become more so. A third is on climate change, and we could go on. I think that what we're seeing now with the crisis and decline, really, of the American empire is that there are going to be all kinds of such international questions opening up. Right now, but the question is who collaborates with who? How do you link up something? And maybe there's more. I'm not in the greatest position to say. I don't see a lot right now. I suppose people could go into something like DSA and start, raising, collaboration with, some groupings abroad, in terms of actually practically trying to do it. Other than that, I'm open to whatever, suggestions people had. I don't want to put myself forward as the answer man here. I don't have them.
Thank you, Jack. Temos, you're the next speaker to indicate.
Yes, I was very hesitant to speak for the reason that I don't know much about the details of what's going on in the movement in the USA, and perhaps I know a bit more about what's happening in Britain, but not much. And hearing all this dismissive description of DSA, of Mamdani, the dismissive description I heard many times in these meetings about Corbyn and his party and his what's going on. I was reminded of what was happening in Greece from 2012 to 2015, when Syriza was growing up and things started to happen. And at that time, one of the most revolutionary activists in Cyprus said in a meeting that, look, I can tell you that I am a reformist. And I feel a bit the same now, because I agree that there is no alternative, but the way how is this alternative going to be built? It is never an easy thing to do, and it definitely cannot be built from above. It cannot be built from a group just having the right ideas. We have to build it together with the class. And Syriza, what happened there is that Syriza was taking part in every movement that was taking part in Greece. And there were a lot of movements there. When everybody else was just seeing the movement as a distraction, Syriza was there with them. And that's how the Syriza party was built. And that's how they managed to take power in Greece. And that's how they led Greece to the brink of revolution. Of course, at the critical time, they betrayed the movement, but it was a very specific point. I mean, it was just very easy to imagine the leadership of Syriza taking the decision to continue from the win of the referendum and lead Greece to revolution. We are talking about a clash with the bourgeoisie in Greece, with the ruling class of Europe, and they got 63% of the vote in the referendum. That was a ticket for revolution. They didn't take it. But this doesn't mean that all the previous work that they had done is wrong. It's not. And talking about Britain, I mean, we are talking about 800,000 people ready to join the party. That's a huge movement. That's a huge basis from which to build that. But why did we have 800,000 pounds? 800,000 people wanting to join the party? Because it was the Corbyn legacy there. Because it was Corbyn. And it's criminal that we had to see all this impatience to turn this into a revolutionary party. It takes time, and it takes work, and it takes organization. And unless we are able to do that, we are not ready for revolution. And you must understand that. I can see the same thing with Mamdani. Yes, he's going to hit the limitations of capitalism. But that's where it's our contribution should be, and put out policies that would speak to the masses, that would be able to give alternatives, to show that Mamdani is not just a distraction, but it's expressing a real break with what's happening. And he should do more than he is doing. But this needs patience, organization, and clear policies. I'm not saying that we should be putting out just support leaflets and supporting all these people who, in all probability, they could go either way when the critical time comes. But we should be very clear what they are doing, why they should be supported, what is the hope that the class has from these people, and how to win the consciousness of the class through action. It's not enough just to put a position in meetings and try to convince people. That's not how it's going to pan out. Revolution is in front of us, and we should understand this. And when I say it's in front of us, I'm not saying it will happen tomorrow. It's in front of us in the sense that the ruling class doesn't know what it's doing. The ruling class is split. The capitalist system is collapsing. It's just that we don't have the power to take advantage of what's going on. We should build that, and I think that in order to build that, we have to be careful to gather all these forces that are appearing. You could say that Bernie Sanders was part of the ruling class. Maybe if he was, it shows the split in the ruling class, and we should capitalize on it. We should not just dismiss it. It's nothing. It's a distraction. It's not. And we cannot see that We cannot say that elections are the most important thing. Elections are simple episodes in the class struggle, minor ones, but they show a lot. They show the temperature of what's going on in a society. They show how people think, and we should be patient to analyze this, organize, and not run away from every organization that has success because they don't have the full correct policy.
Thank you, Timos. Our next speaker is Jimmy, who will be followed by Matthew.
Thanks, Finn. What I wanted to do was raise some questions specifically on this construction manufacturing sector in the United States. The question of the interruption of employment, of security, of wages, conditions of workers in the manufacturing and in the clerical white-collar areas is fairly well predicted. But in the construction industries, they're going to be very dependent on an increase in housing stock, increase in the construction sites, increase in the machine transformation within the manufacturing plants. Now, the questions I wanted to ask are, first of all, am I correct in that outlining that sort of a scenario, that there will be a demand for skilled labour over the next period? And is there any conscious attempt being made to train people for such a revolutionary change in industrialization in the States? Is there serious investment in the training of young people, or is it going to be a sort of a modular race to the bottom, which is one of the problems here in Europe, where there's a lot of not de-skilling, but fracturing of skilling and limiting of skilling of young people. The other question is specifically in relation to housing. Europe, from east to west, is faced with a common crisis of lack of housing. Does the same problem exist in the States in a broad sense rather than in concentrated areas? Who is responsible for housing? Is it public or is it private investment that builds the homes for people? And who owns the land, and who owns the land after the houses are built? The final question then is in relation to the trade unions. Is there any evidence that the trade union leaders consider that society in the States is going through a phase of not just political change, but also of industrial change, which are going to open up opportunities in one area with serious crises and confrontations in the other? And is there any attempt any evidence rather, within the union movement of internal opposition to the bureaucracies, the very well-paid, pensioned bureaucrats? And one simple example of the bureaucracy that appeared recently here is that the union that I'm a member of in the last couple of years, because of its cooperation with American unions, found itself subject to regular requests for large donations of money to add to the pension pot of American bureaucrats, which indicated a severe separation between the lifestyle and expectations of the leadership and the lifestyle and expectations of the membership. So the question I ask, is there any opposition or evidence of opposition at the lower levels of the trade union movement to the wealthy lifestyle of the bureaucracies?
Thank you, Jimmy. Very significant questions there. Matthew. You're muted, Matthew.
Oh, so I turned the microphone on. Yeah, sorry, comments. Yeah, I know. I agree with Jimmy in terms of this is part of the process, isn't it? The breakdown, the disintegration of the mechanisms of control. That actually, you do see, the bureaucracy is now, one on a incomes a multiple, in some cases, a very large multiple of the people they supposedly represent. And secondly, increasingly, they don't actually come. I mean, in the old days, of course, the bureaucrats tended to come from the workforces they represented. That's not the case anymore. Very frequently, you see these guys have just got no interest, have no basis in terms of actually organising or being in these workplaces whatsoever. So, in those terms, you'd think it will move. I think there's a couple of things. I mean, first of all, the other thing, I think the other impact of the war in the Middle East is going to be in the US in particular, is that Trump has managed to very seriously piss off the Gulf coordination countries, which, Saudi, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, UAE, etc., by having a war, which of course they didn't want, and they told him they didn't want it, and then doing them extensive damage. I mean, enormous political and physical damage, economic damage to the country. Now, the Qataris actually, interesting, raised the question, well, under these conditions, why are we investing all our money in the bloody United States? And they've actually said, why are we putting our money in that place? Which is a good question. And they did in terms of the specifics of because they are one of the principal financiers of Ellison's takeover of Paramount. Ellison's takeover of Warner Brothers through Paramount to take over Warner Brothers, which is the biggest deal going. It depends on Saudi and Qatari money. And the Qataris have said, well, if the Saudis agree, then we should pull our money from that. That also applies to AI as well, which is also incredibly dependent on Gulf money. So the question will be, do the GCC countries say, no, we're going to put our money somewhere else. We're just not going to keep financing the economy of the US, which would be a very serious effect, and move things very differently. I think the other thing, I do agree with some of what Temos has said, but I think it goes further than that. I think that if you look at it historically, I mean, clearly the key point in the US, of course, is the McCarthy period, because the McCarthy process was to remove the left from the unions, etc., and to suppress the left. That was the point, and it's never really been able to recover from that. And therefore, you get this situation where the left has not been able to build mass base or any prolonged base in terms of sections of the working class, precisely because of that. And I think that you can see it in terms of I mean here in Britain. I mean, I think he's right in terms of saying 800,000 people, but I mean that fundamentally 800,000 people expressing interest in Corbyn is a class response. It's the level of the active section of the working class saying we need something different. We need something different. And I don't. The thing is, obviously in the US it's different because you just don't have that sort of. There's not that tradition, and as Jack said, you've also got the thing is sectionalized in different areas and quite different, and you don't have that sort of the history of prolonged sort of activity in terms of if you look at in Britain, I mean obviously the working class is particularly active from the 50s through to the 90s. But you do have that sort of class consciousness, degree of class consciousness, which you don't have in the States, except in certain places. So in those terms, it's different. But you don't say, okay, well, in what ways, as Temos has said, does that start to move? But it's also about, I think, the other thing, of course, is the mechanisms whereby the class the working class is controlled. If we look at it, the control through the unions, controlled in Britain through the Labour Party, and all of that is falling apart. The question is then the question, well, what does the left pose as alternative? How does the left exploit that? I mean, you sort of talk about, clearly the problem is it becomes things like, if you see Syriza, I mean, Syriza rises really out of the Euro-communist side of the Communist Party. And it's actually the same politics in some ways as what Corbyn has done, because what Corbyn has done is to say, okay, we're going to have this left populist stuff, which is precisely against the working class. Obviously with a completely different character, with an active working class in Greece and an inactive one in Britain, but it's in political terms of the same route. It's then to say, okay, well, what actually is going to move that. If you look back to the 30s, I mean, the thing is, you did have in the 30s, a series of political organisations with a national reach and serious influence. Likes of, I mean, obviously the Communist Party, obviously with the issue of the Communist Party being Stalinist and betraying, and the rest of it. But it existed and it allowed an activity. Musti's American Workers' Party, again, very influential in terms of building the CIO. I mean, huge, effective in terms of the particularly obviously the foundation of the UAW. And then of course the SWP, American SWP. But of course, all of that, as I say, is cleaned out in McCarthy and removed from the organised working class. And it's then just how does that start? Does it start to come back together? And the problem being, of course, also as you say, I mean, the left is organic. It can't sort of self-generate. It can't. It has to be connected to an actual movement of the working class. It's not. It can't exist separate from it, or in terms of think of itself. As a sort of idealist thing. It's actually generate from the working class, but it's then to say, well, to what theoretical level does it operate? And the problem being, of course, at the moment, theoretical level is terrible. Anyway, thanks.
Thank you, Matthew. At this point, we should be drawing the discussion towards a conclusion. We'll be asking Jack to give a summary, as he sees it, of the main points that were raised in the discussion. But before we ask Jack to do that, is there any final questions that comrades want to ask? Okay, Jack, if there's some rounding up points or generalizations you want to make arising from the discussion, which
so
you
let
just
me
said.
start with a point Matthew just made. I don't fully agree that it was the McCarthy period that was responsible for cleaning the left out and the current position. Go back to the end of the 1930s upsurges and the deal that ended it with the establishment of the National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB, and the National Labor Relations Act, and so on. And then the no strike pledge in World War II. You essentially had a tying of the union leadership of the militancy in with the state, and that influence has just increased and increased since then. And so it was the legislation, Taft-Hartley and Landrum-Griffin, after the war, that that is especially handicapped, and that was coming with or without McCarthy. McCarthy certainly made it worse and certainly cleared out generation of militants. People should realize that in the 1960s, there were actually more cumulative strike days than there were in the 1930s in the U.S. when you had the construction of the of public sector unions, especially the teachers' unions and the hospital workers' unions, and so on. And so I think that that we can't just look at the McCarthy period, but I think we need to look at the disciplining of labor that took place, the end and collaboration between the labor leadership and the state, culminating in the end of the upsurge of the 1930s, and then into the war and the no strike pledge and the disciplining of labor there. I don't want to say that that there wasn't a major effect in the McCarthy period, but I think we have to look to these factors. I want to talk about Jimmy's questions, which and points which I think were very interesting and important. So to start with construction, so the construction, the building trades are certainly getting a boost through the huge increase in quote unquote defense spending and military budget that many of the big defense contractors are big construction developers in general, and So I think that that we should look at the role that the building trades unions play. The building trades unions are an especial brake on struggle in the U.S. They opt for those policies which favor jobs for their members, which include anything, no matter what, could destroy the environment, be bringing some of the worst, weaponry and so on. But if the jobs for the workers, they will be for it. In Oakland and the Bay Area, they have been for numerous projects, which have been, overall destructive to the living standards of the working class, but benefiting short-term jobs for the building trades union. They're separate from the labor councils. The building trades have their own councils, and so play a role of being an especial brake on struggle and divisiveness. This has been long been a question. Is there investment in training of young people? I think so. I don't follow things as closely in education and training as I did when I was an active teacher and the several years after that. There were big programs going on in which the Democrats were attempting to turn the two-year colleges, the junior colleges, into training grounds for industry. But necessarily that involved, more of an emphasis on job training programs. I think some of that, still has carried over. So I think that, but what I don't know is who gets trained and how, in terms of, to what degree is this distributed demographically, racially, in different sectors of the country and so on. But that there is such training, I believe it is going on, although I'm sure that it's not going on in ways and as effectively as we would like, but I believe it is. So I think that's a good point. Housing, is there a problem of a lack of housing? There's a huge housing crisis in the U.S. There's a huge housing crisis in California. One of the questions is, and I'm actually involved. I kind of got pulled into housing struggles by developments that are going on right where I live. And I've actually become fairly actively involved in it. One of the questions is this a question of production or distribution? So in Oakland, there are a large number now. Basically, in California, the Democratic-run state and state legislature is turning housing and construction policy over to the big development interests, the real estate interests, and the developers who are being given license to basically have carte blanche to do what they want. There are many market rate towers now without affordable units that are going half empty, where you have an enormous housing crisis. You hear about the homelessness crisis in San Francisco, but Oakland, with half the population, has almost double the number of homeless. So in other words, 3 to 4 times, proportionally, and very little is being done. There are laws to give incentives for affordability, but affordability has several different levels. The highest of which puts, which is the one that is chosen by the developers when they choose any at all, puts housing out of reach of, I would say, 80% or more of working people, including even faculty members at the University of California. So housing it's a major problem, and there are studies which show that just increasing supply through market rate has a very almost negligible trickle down effect. There are other studies which are being put forward by the real estate industry which challenge that. I believe those are cherry-picked, and extremely, shoddy. But those are big questions. So housing is a major question for working people in Oakland. Teachers, for example, have to many either live like graduate students or undergraduate students, 4 to a one-room apartment, or commute more than 50 miles each way to get to work in order to try to find, housing that they can afford. And this is not true just if I know it from, from teachers because of my background and as a retired teacher, but it's also true of many other workers. And demographically, it's also led to cleaning out the working class from large parts of San Francisco, and now the same is being done in Oakland, and especially Black workers and poor. And that was deliberate. Back 50 years ago, Walter Shorenstein, one of the major developer in the U.S., with a close friend of Senator Dianne Feinstein and her husband, Richard Blum, the billionaire, who was the main alpha trustee at the University of California, Berkeley. Shorenstein said, and that this area, is too beautiful for them. Them were Black people living in Hunters Point and Visitation Valley areas of San Francisco, and other areas south of Market. They needed to be moved out in order to make way for the for what that time were called yuppies, and what had become essentially the permanent class of highly paid technical workers, the upper crust in the Silicon Valley. So yes, housing is a major area, and it's an area which should be an area of struggle. Any electoral formation movement and so on has to take that up as one of the critical areas. Trade unions, is there any visible opposition, organized or otherwise, to this upper crust of trade union leaders who are living their lifestyle? Andy Stern, who was the president of one of the major public sector unions, is now a professor of business at Columbia University. Before he became that, he had a salary of $800,000 a year, for example. It's just one example, but it's a whole layer. The most visible opposition is in around labor notes, which was initiated by the American IS in the 1970s, and is basically continued with the American IS folded into an organization called Solidarity. They're not they're not in direct organizational control of it, but it's their members and former members who form the leadership of it. And Labor Notes gets thousands of people to their national conventions and have rank and file caucuses in various unions. However, when they have actually gained power in unions, they have acted themselves very similar to the leadership that they replaced. They tend to not operate on a programmatic basis. They don't. They operate as mainly caucuses for democracy. Teamsters for a Democratic Union. And various, this caucus for democracy and that and so on, focusing on union democracy. But most of the unions are formally democratic in that they have formal elections. And the question is, how do you empower the membership, and how do you do that on a program that calls for what's needed by workers in that union and more broadly making connections throughout, the working class. And they've tended to operate, as a alternative leadership. And then when they come in, have not operated differently. And I can give you examples in the Los Angeles Teachers Union, where the Progressive Educators Action Caucus won a majority on their board, for example, in 2005. And they will admit now that they operated basically the same as the former leadership. In the Teamsters Union, where Ron Carey was elected president in the 1980s, and Teamsters for Democratic Union basically got a majority, I believe, on the executive board. Similar problems occurred. They tend to move to the center when they come in, and become an alternative leadership, rather than building and reaching out and on a program that embraces both their members' needs and attempts to influence the entire labor movement, and through that the working class. So I hope that that's as much of an answer as I can give. There are other developments. For example, it's more mixed in Chicago, where the Chicago Teachers Union, which was taken over by in 2012 by the Core Caucus. They're more mixed in what they've done, but overall, I think that they've more or less become entrenched. But they were able to sustain more for a period of time. I could go into this in detail, but there's not really time for that. So the question is, can any of these labor notes caucuses be turned into, or labor notes as a whole, into a force? Or can there be at least a section of it that could be turned into, into more of a force for challenging the entire, bureaucracy and the bureaucratic structure? I'm skeptical that that's going to happen inside labor notes, but I believe that people who come to labor notes, and I think that if I were not 80 years old, I would, think of operating more in terms of trying to go to their conferences and form a section, because that's where that's what exists. It's where, when you had the Red State Uprising, it was to the labor notes and their associates in education came in to offer support, to teachers, and then guided it, to the insurgents in West Virginia, in Kentucky, in Arizona. Then they guided things, I think, back towards moderation, but it's where you'd want to be, and trying to meet people and trying to form, a fighting alternative. I'm going to stop there.
Yeah. Thank you, Jack. Thank you for a very interesting opening contribution, very informative, and also the interventions that you made during the course of the discussion. I must say it was a very informative meeting overall. The contributions that all the comrades made who spoke were very useful and very stimulating, and everybody will go away a lot wiser and anxious to resolve the questions that have been raised. So thank you again, Jack, for the interesting contributions. Now,
thanks, everybody.
Unfortunately,
it was a good meeting.
Roger's not here, so we want to get some idea about next week. Now, a message will go out on email about the meeting next week, and all you comrades will be informed about it. But I don't know if Pam, have you got information you want to give us about next week?
I can't remember. I'm sure I know at the back of my mind, but I can't remember. But the email will go out as usual on Wednesday.
Yeah, so it's important that comrades keep an eye on their emails, and there will be a message going out. Jimmy, you're waving.
Next week's meeting, the one after May Day, we are having a revisit to Belarus. The theme of the meeting will be the repression of trade unions, and we will be having Gennady Fedonich, who is the leader of the REP, the Radio and Electronic Workers Trade Union, who will be speaking. There's also another prisoner, Vladislav, who is Sorry, explain. Gennady was in prison until fairly recently. All the leadership of the union were arrested and given 8 and 9 year sentences, a lot in solitary. But one of them, Vladislav, is in a critical situation with health issues. And again, he's the same generation that the rest of us are, as Jack described. But his daughter, Victoria, will be speaking as well and covering the personal situation that her father is in against the background of the general situation of the repression of trade unions in Belarus. Hannah will be again acting as interpreter for the meeting.
Thank you, Jimmy.
That's in 2 weeks, isn't it? What did we say about next week? Can you remember? Because next week's May Day weekend.
That's for the 3rd.
That's it, right? Okay, sorry, that's me, right?
Yeah, so Conor should note that Gennady and Vladislav are heroic leaders of the trade union movement in Belarus. Both have been imprisoned, both have been tortured, and both have been denied medical treatment. In the case of Vladislav, his life is currently in danger in prison. So Belarusian comrades plus Hannah, who's also a representative of the REP union, will be speaking as well. So keep an eye on your emails and you'll get a notice with further information about the content of the meeting next weekend. So in the meantime, thank you all, comrades, for your attendance. So
Finn, can I say something?
Felicity, of course you can.
Sorry, it's about Marcia in Namibia. Yes. Marcia's got an important hearing in her case coming up, and she has to pay for her representative's travel to the hearing. So it's basically a plea for people to, if you've got direct links, to send it to Marcia, send some money to Marcia, and if not, you can send it to me. But we need to make sure that this thing doesn't fall at this last stand, where she could lose this. I mean, those people who don't know, Marcia is a guard on an uranium mine in Namibia, and they had a union, quite a good little union set up, and she spoke to the press, and her employers sacked her because she spoke to the press about what the union was doing, and she's fought now for 2 years to try and get her job back, and this is one of the final steps that she can take, but it involves she has to pay for someone coming to her very small town, really, from the capital, to represent her from the union. So we're just trying to do a collection for her.
Thank you, Felicity, for raising that. Marcia has been a close colleague of the WIN International over many years. So if comrades want to make a contribution towards the cost that Marcia is having to face, you can contact the WIN structure directly, and we will then be in touch in turn with Felicity. Is that okay, Felicity? If we do,
yeah, that's fine. Just okay. I know comrades want to support her. It's just this particular point it's quite hard for this to get this bit done.
Yeah, thank you.
It's wonderful to think she's also organising a kind of May Day demonstration in her little town. So it's, she's a great comrade, needs support.
That's very good. Thank you for raising that, Felicity. And if you could send a message, we'll circulate it through the WIN network to the comrades who are in contact with us.
I'll email it today.
Okay.
All right. Thanks very much.
Okay. Thank you, Felicity. And thank you all again. So good night. Slán go léir agus íhuaá.
Agus tú féin.
Yeah.